Executive Director. And this meeting is being recorded. I am the Executive Director of OLLI, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Berkshire Community College. OLLI provides a wide variety of educational opportunities to its over 1,300 members and to the greater Berkshires community. I'd like to welcome you all to the first lecture in OLLI's 2020 Distinguished Speaker Series, presented online for the first time. And I'm very happy to see so many people here today. I want to thank our co-sponsors for tonight's event, the Berkshire County branch of the NAACP and the Mahaiwe Performing Arts Center. We appreciate their support in sharing information about this presentation with their members and friends. First, a few housekeeping details. This talk is presented in Zoom's webinar format, which means your audio and video are not turned on. You can relax and make yourself comfortable. We welcome questions and comments, which will be addressed in the discussion period after Ms. McCulloch-Dews' presentation. They can be submitted via the chat function found at the bottom of your screen on most devices. If you can't see it, just drag your cursor to the bottom of your screen and the menu should pop up. Feel free to write questions and comments during her presentation, and we will address them afterwards. And finally, please note, as I mentioned before, that this presentation is being live streamed both on OLLI's Facebook page as well as on Pittsfield Community Television. Thank you, PCTV. And will be available to view on demand later in both places. So if you'd like to share this presentation with friends, we encourage you to do so. Now, on to the main event. We are very honored to present Roberta McCulloch-Dews, who will be speaking on the policing of Black people in public spaces, an old trend that legislation has the power to stop. Her talk is based on a policy paper she wrote while completing her master's degree at SUNY Empire. Roberta serves as Director of Administrative Services in the Office of the Mayor for the City of Pittsfield and is a communications professional with 2 decades of experience. She began her career as a newspaper journalist in 2000 and later transitioned to marketing communications and public relations. In the Berkshires, her roles have included communications liaison for the CEO of Berkshire Health Systems, as well as several positions at the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts. In addition, she is an extraordinary volunteer as well as having a much more than full-time job. She is a trustee on the board of the Norman Rockwell Museum and a member of the board for the Elizabeth Freeman Center. She serves as a member of the Equity and Diversity Committee for the Central Berkshire Regional School District and as a youth mentor with the Rites of Passage and Empowerment Program, or ROPE. She's a former commissioner on the Berkshire County Commission on the Status of Women and was a finalist for the 2015 Berkshire Trendsetters Changemaker Under 40 Award. In 2016, Roberta was part of the inaugural class of 40 Under 40, selected by Berkshire Community College. Roberta graduated from New York University with a bachelor's degree in journalism. In 2012, she participated in a year-long program, the Leadership Institute for Public Policy and Impact, through the Women's Fund of Western Massachusetts. And in 2019, she earned her master's degree in social and public policy and an advanced certificate in project management from SUNY Empire. We are very grateful to Roberta for sharing her knowledge and insight with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming Roberta McCulloch-Dews.
Well, thank you, Megan, for that wonderful introduction. Wow, thank you so much. I just want to thank OLLI. I want to thank the Berkshire County chapter of the NAACP, and I want to thank the Mahaiwe Performing Arts Center for creating this space. But most importantly, I want to thank each and every one of you who have decided to join this conversation tonight, whether virtually or via PCTV. Thank you, PCTV, or via social media. Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation tonight. So I just want to set the stage a little bit as I get into tonight's talk. And I want to talk about the national climate, which we know right now is really ripe for change. We have seen tremendous social unrest in our country. I think every part of the country right now, there's a call for reform, and it's coming across loud and clear. And the message that we're getting is that we need safe and equitable spaces, and we need them now. But part of this aspect of reform, I would say, is the fact that we also have an opportunity to look at another element of policing. And this takes me into the backstory. As Megan briefly mentioned, the whole idea behind this policy memo came together in my final year as a social and public policy student, grad student at SUNY Empire. And I think I knew pretty right away, like in 2019, that I wanted to focus my policy memo on what was happening around the policing of Black people in public spaces. I recall in 2018, the many, many instances, which I'm going to get into later, of Black people, Black men, women, and children who had been policed in public spaces. And at that point, I said, well, you know, if I'm going to write something, I don't want it to sit on a shelf somewhere. I wanted to draft an actionable policy memo. And it was my hope that it would actually do some good. So within the policy memo that I drafted, I wanted to identify the historical framework surrounding the policing of Black Americans in the United States. I wanted to talk about the impact of bias. And I also wanted to explore the role of anti-discrimination legislation in addressing discriminatory behavior. Okay. So we see this hashtag, LivingWhileBlack, and that actually was a real hashtag in 2018. And what we saw that year, as I alluded to previously, was the fact that there was a spate of bias-related calls back to back to back to back to back. And within these calls, what we saw was that law enforcement was being called to investigate these bystander observations and accounts on the part of the caller regarding Black men, women, and children who are occupying public and community spaces. It seemed that no space was immune to the harassment. Public parks, pools, golf courses, streets, stores, businesses, and college campuses are just some of the examples of the spaces where this kind of policing occurred. Now, I've listed a couple of the some of the instances that garnered national attention, but I will expound on 3 of them. There was the Starbucks incident in Philadelphia, and we saw there that 3 men, I think they were waiting for someone to join their party. They were sitting down and they didn't buy anything, but again, many people go to Starbucks and hang out. Now, the employee saw them and thought they were suspicious and called the police. Okay, that resulted in a lot of reforms at Starbucks. We see at Yale, there was a grad student who fell asleep as she was working really hard, probably working on a paper, fell asleep in the calming space. Another student saw her, and instead of maybe asking, are you okay? She said, I'm going to call campus security, and that's what she did. So we have an instance where a grad student is asleep in the lounge and another student calls campus security without asking, are you supposed to be there? But there was already the underlying suspicion that she shouldn't be. In San Francisco, we saw that an 8-year-old girl was selling water outside of her building. She was with her mother, and a tenant of the building called the police because she said, they're too loud. So again, what could have been handled with perhaps a simple conversation turned into the calling of police. Now, I just wanted to just bring you up to speed because May and June of 2020, even in the midst of a pandemic, we still have seen more of the same. I've listed 4 accounts, and you might have heard of one of them, but these are just the ones that we know of. I believe that there are probably a lot more out there. Travis Miller, he is a Black delivery man, and this took place in a gated community. He was dropping off a package, and the president of the Homeowners Association actually blocked him in. Now, Mr. Miller was in full uniform, was driving the truck, the delivery truck, yet the gentleman blocked him in and said that he wanted to see ID. He didn't trust that he was who he said he was, or even appeared to be who he said he was. And it was only until the intervention of the homeowner that Mr. Miller was allowed to go. Christian Cooper, you might have heard about that incident because it happened in Central Park, and there was a video that garnered like more than 30 million views. But in that instance, Mr. Cooper was bird watching, and he encountered a woman named Amy Cooper. They're of no relation, and there was an exchange regarding Miss Cooper's dog. So At that point, something went on between both of them, but there was no kind of offense or any kind of violence. But Ms. Cooper said that she was going to call the police and say that an African-American man was harassing her. And indeed, we did see that Ms. Cooper did call the police on Mr. Cooper. Okay, so that was an instance where nothing obviously was going on, but Ms. Cooper knew that she could use law enforcement in this way. We have another instance, Sit-in While Black on Manhattan's Upper Side. A resident called the police on a woman who was just sitting on a bench, and this woman claimed that the woman sitting down was harassing her. Again, we did see a video. There was no such harassment, but police were utilized in a way to support the caller's intentions. And finally, just this week, we see the case of a man in San Francisco, and he was stenciling Black Lives Matter in front of his own property. Now, here's the kicker. A couple walked by, and they were white, and they said to him, "Should you be doing that?" And the man who actually started recording video really wasn't in the mood to really answer the questions. So they asked a couple more questions. We don't necessarily from the video know if they actually called the cops. What we do know is that they walked away. But here's the thing. They said, well, we know the owners of the property. Well, the gentleman stenciling the property was the owner. They didn't think he was the owner, and it was an obvious lie. So we see here again, these instances show more accounts of policing. And it's important that we identify the common thread because, you know, these aren't just one-offs. There is a common thread that ties all these instances, regardless of the difference in location, regardless if it was Black men or women or children. We know that the unifying factor among each of these scenarios is that the nuisance calls that were placed to police were made by white individuals who based their accounts not on the witnessing or experiencing of actual crimes or offenses, but rather a suspicion about the individuals in question. I highlighted the word suspicion in red because it's something that we're going to revisit a couple of times throughout this talk. So I want you to hang on to that word. So when we think about policing, it's really important that we acknowledge a few things up front. I want to surmise that whether unintentional or intentional, these acts of policing have to be recognized as a form of discrimination. And it's a form of discrimination in which law enforcement is playing a supporting role. Now, that's not to say that law enforcement is, complicit in it from a standpoint in which they understand that role, but they're playing a supporting role when they have to respond to these calls. So I want to just show right now the difference in terms of how different groups view the police. And I found some research found some data from the Pew Research and Gallup poll, and it showed that there is a stark difference among whites and Blacks when it comes to the interactions with police. 60% of whites believe in law enforcement as an institution versus 37% of Blacks who believe in law enforcement as an institution. Now that's a very stark difference. And I want to add something on top of that. Okay, so we know that this disparity exists, but this disparity is rooted in something deeper. And so I want you to focus on this statement that the mobilization of law enforcement for unfounded nuisance calls is not only a diversion of public resources, but it perpetuates the weaponization of police against Black people. And this is something that dates back to our country's origins. So again, the disparities that we see in terms of how police are viewed isn't in a vacuum. This is something that is tied into our country's origins. And so that accounts for how police are used in modern day times. So in order to understand how police are used currently, we're going to take a trip back in time. So in order to fully understand the whole process, I selected some information that would give you an idea of the laws that were in place, as well as how our modern day law enforcement came to be. So Virginia was a slave-holding state, right? The Commonwealth of Virginia. And they passed 130 slave statutes between 1689 and 1865 for the sole purpose of restricting restricting the actions of Black people. Now, the slave patrol, which is the forerunner of the modern day law enforcement that we know today, was actually developed to serve the economic needs of the white majority. So who was the white majority? They were wealthy landowners, they were men. And the sole purpose of the slave patrol was to recover and punish slaves who were considered property. So that was their job, to retrieve people who had run away. Now, we look on the federal level and we see that the United States fugitive slave laws further allowed for the capture and punishment of runaway slaves. So not only do we see that on the state level we have legislation, we also see there's legislation on the federal level, and we couple that with the law enforcement body, right? So we have all of that working in concert to restrict Black people in public spaces. And the thing about it is, at this time, it's codified. It's part of our society. So we started off with the restriction of Black people in this society. It was a part of who we are. So that's a very important foundation to remember. Now, when slavery was abolished in 1865, it brought in a brief respite, and it's something called Reconstruction. And I'm a big fan of this time period because I consider it a fleeting time of promise and possibility in America's history. It lasted 12 years, so it really didn't last that long. But it was a time when people who were formerly enslaved actually had the opportunity to vote. They actually had the opportunity to hold positions of power. They actually had an opportunity to experience their lives and enjoy a quality of life. And for that reason, those in the southern states did not like that, right? So imagine having people who were considered chattel slavery, who are part of chattel slavery, right? They were chattel, and they were the economic lifeblood of your state, your community. Imagine them now sitting across from you. It was something that just couldn't be tolerated. And so Reconstruction didn't last long, because that was a power system that had the power of Black people in that moment had to be dismantled. Their quality of life was not okay, because it was an offense. It was an affront to those who had previously enslaved them. So we see that after Reconstruction, there was the implementation of what's called Black codes. And Black codes were its policy. This is real policy now that was put in place to monitor and limit the personal freedoms of Black Americans. So think about it. We had Reconstruction, but after Reconstruction, we went right back into codifying the restrictions of Black people through all this policy. So when we think about Black codes and what exactly they restricted Black people from doing, there's a whole entire list, and I wasn't going to post all of them here, but I just have some examples for you. Insulting gestures and language. These are some of the disorderly offenses that we talk about. Engaging in malicious mischief, preaching the gospel without a license, or taking employment other than as farmers or servants. So we see here that you can't sing, you can't talk, you can't get the job that you want, you can't have fun, right? So these are some of the rules that prevented Black people from living, and those were the Black codes. Furthermore, the Black codes did something that went beyond just restricting the daily life of Black people. It maintained the status quo social hierarchy, right? It created a system where everyone was in their quote unquote place. And that was what was the intention and purpose of the codes. But also these codes lay the foundation for the institutionalized system of segregation, more commonly known as Jim Crow. And it's important to note again that none of these policies would have been effective without the support of law enforcement to carry them through. So we have this history. We have this legacy of institutionalized restrictions and segregation. So where does that leave our communities, right? Well, we know that our communities, American communities today, are very disparate. And we know that people live in homogenous settings. And there's an academic term, and it's called spatial separateness. And it says that social relationships are structured along racial lines. And when that happens, this in turn has the effect of perpetuating and reinforcing social and economic inequality. So it's academic speak, so I kind of want to break it down a little bit for you. When you think about communities in America, we have to understand that a lot of thought and a lot of investment went into the development of communities. Who gets to be a part of it? The resources that are there or the lack thereof. We know that things like restrictive covenants prevented people from experiencing a good quality of life. So you have a setting where you have certain communities where life is good, and you have other communities where it's a little bit more challenging. But our communities are the spaces where our thoughts, our ideas are formed, right? That's the place where we get to develop these relationships. So if we're in spaces in which we only see ourselves, if we never see people who don't look like us, we have no point of reference for people who are other. So we only see what we see. And that contributes to the lens through which we see the world. So that's important to note because American communities are prevalent to this day. And we have to understand that even though segregation was dismantled and overt racist systems were dismantled, discrimination did not disappear. What we have today as a result of our communities that are so homogenous, so separate, what we have is a legacy of skewed perceptions and accepted beliefs. And when we talk about Blacks in America, we're, among the majority, there is the feeling that there are these unequal and unjust distribution of power and resources in America. So again, we have to realize that this has resulted in skewed perceptions, accepted beliefs about Blacks among the majority, as well as unequal and unjust distribution of power and resource in America. So it never went away. It was always with us. And this is important because we have this foundation, right? We have this foundation of separateness. We have this foundation where we're only able to form our opinions based on what we see. So guess what? It's a recipe for unconscious bias. So unconscious bias is defined as the social stereotypes about certain groups of people that individuals form outside of their own conscious awareness. It's what's deep down inside of you. And so aversive racism is the acting out of your unconscious bias, and it results in a range of microaggressions to microassaults, and that's for the people on the receiving end. So again, unconscious bias are the thoughts that you think, and aversive racism is the action. And I wanted to spotlight this particular study because it shows implicit bias in action. And this study featured white registered voters in California who were shown various pictures of the prison population in that state. And the variable factors that distinguish the pictures included terms like less Black or more Black. Then the folks in the study, they were asked about the 3 strikes law and the mandatory minimum of a 25-year sentence that automatically applied to the third offense, even if it was minor. And then here's where they had the action. They were given the opportunity to file a petition to lessen the harshness of the law. All right. 23.7% of the participants who thought that there were relatively more Black inmates were less likely to sign the petition, while 51.7% who thought that there were fewer Black inmates signed on. Now, I wasn't a part of the study, the making of the study, and so I can't necessarily speak to what the participants were thinking. But I would say that most people wouldn't necessarily say overt racist things or own up to that if asked. But unconscious bias doesn't play out in the words that we speak. It plays out in those things that occur by way of studies just like this. So I gave you this historical foundation, and I know it was pretty quick, and I gave you some points, but it's important to understand that there is a trajectory here that, again, policing doesn't occur as a one-off. It's built upon a foundation. And there's also a lens through which we see each other. And through that lens, we either determine who belongs or who doesn't. And it's because of that narrow view. This is why the policing of Black people continue to happen, because of this skewed perception. So I want to talk right now because I talked about the history of police and I talked about why it occurs, right? But, you know, it's humiliating. And I think to the Negro Motorist Green Book that was published back in 1936. And I think about how this book had to be developed, right? It was developed by an African-American mail carrier. His name was Victor Green. He was from New York. And he developed this because it was important that he create something for Black people to travel America safely, because it wasn't safe for them to do so. Or they would be denied stay in lodgings or restaurants if they didn't have this book. So this book provided a blueprint. It allowed them to travel safely in these public spaces. Now, it ceased publication in 1966, so we're not talking ancient history here. This is pretty recent, right? And again, this was a book that was created to help Black people go through public spaces. I also include the case of Colander versus Edward Lawson, and he was a Black professional who had dreadlocks. And he was stopped by the police 15 times over a 2-year period because he was traveling in a well-to-do neighborhood in California. And they kept stopping him. And you know what his charge was? The charge was violating a vagrancy ordinance requiring suspicious persons to provide credible and reliable identification to a requesting police officer. There's that word again, suspicious. Well, guess what? Mr. Lawson was tired and he actually filed a lawsuit because he felt that stopping him and policing him in this way was unconstitutional. I also share the account from the late sociology professor, Laura T. Fishman. She was a Black woman, and she shared her experience of being stopped numerous times by the police because she too was deemed suspicious. And I included her quote here because I thought it was pretty powerful, and I just want to read it. Not only was I rudely questioned about my purpose for walking in these neighborhoods, frequently I was required to give proof that I was not a prostitute, heroin addict, or maniac. In one case, I was warned not to return to the neighborhood unless I was acting in a service capacity for some white household. Again, she was a professor, and that was her experience. Now, they both, Mr. Lawson and Ms. Fishman, their experience actually falls on the scale of explicit bias, but I still thought it was relevant because I think it speaks to the most profound impact of policing in public spaces. So we get to the point where we see the history. We see that this is a long-standing history in the United States of America. It is with us. It is embedded with us. And knowing that, I think it begs the question, with such a legacy, is change even possible? So to that I say, let's take a look at the law. So the first question is, can legislation even be used as a tool to reduce bias-related incidents in public spaces? And to that, I will say yes. And I'm not basing my yes on just my opinion. I'm basing my yes on the fact that I've identified legislation that has served to reduce discrimination. I have two key pieces of legislation that I'm going to go and we're going to talk over. But I want to read the quote by Marguerite Cartwright because I thought it's powerful. And she said, while human nature cannot be changed by law, human behavior or the manifestation of the prejudice or other antisocial attitude can be and often is checked and controlled through law. And that's pretty powerful, because someone once said, well, you can't really legislate someone, you can't legislate their heart. And guess what? We're not asking for legislation to change people's hearts. Their hearts might remain the same. What we're asking is to create a standard that applies to all. So let's take a look at the legislation. So we see with the Ives-Quinn Anti-Discrimination Bill, this was something that was signed into law by Governor Thomas Dewey in 1945. And it was regarded as one of the strongest pieces of legislation to counter racial and religious-based discrimination in employment practices. And you have to remember the time, filling out an application for an employment, people could ask you if you were married, what your religion was. I mean, the questions, today, our standards, we look at that as a violation of privacy. But that was the norm back then. That was the status quo. And so what this legislation did was turn all of that on its head. It was pretty powerful, it was pretty radical for its time, and New York served as a trendsetter. Part of the reason why this legislation worked was the fact that there was something called the New York State Commission Against Discrimination that was specifically formed to gird this legislation and to make sure that it achieved its purpose. So it had this governing body, and that was a good thing. What we saw with this bill was that it had very notable successes. We saw that it reduced the cases of discrimination complaints. It created powerful inroads with the unions, and it revamped the retail industry. So, previously, Black people, they could only, serve in capacities where either they were cleaning or menial positions, right? This allowed them to gain access to positions like buyers and things like that. It really served as a gateway to opportunity. That being said, the bill was not a panacea. We know that there were certain industry holdouts, and there were certain unions and white-collar professions that still found some workarounds, so it wasn't perfect. And we also know that there was some criticism around the commission's decision to rely on persuasive tactics, right? They really wanted to use education versus more punitive actions. So they did get criticized a little bit because of that. I think those who were proponents of the law would have liked to have seen more punitive actions underway. But that being said, it was pretty powerful, and it achieved its purpose, and it served as a precedent for other states to follow. So now I want to turn my attention to legislation on the federal level, and this is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was initiated by President John F. Kennedy, and it was implemented by President Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, undergirding the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we have to set the stage, right? There was the advocacy, the powerful advocacy of the civil rights movement. We know people were sacrificing all that they had because they believed in this movement, and they believed in the power of change. Not only did they take to the streets, but they took to the courts as well. So the movement was a culmination of both grassroots level, grassroots efforts, I should say, as well as litigation, and that served to create the national agenda. It served to create the demand for change. And so this legislation is landmark, it's pivotal, it's something that we still reference today, and it serves as a precedent for more discrimination, anti-discrimination legislation that would follow in the future. It really served as a precedent for that. I want to look at what the law says now, because we see that legislation can work. We see on the state level, we see on the federal level, the power of setting precedents, right? We see that, it's there. We see that we have made gains. So what does the law say now about these nuisance calls? Well, it doesn't really say much about nuisance calls, but we do know it is a crime to file a false police report under federal and state laws, right? We do know that the consequences can range from a misdemeanor to a felony, and it can result in civil liability. And additionally, these reports are helpful if someone who is tired of having, having to be on the receiving end of all of this, they can use it to sue someone who has tried to put them in this position. And that is precisely the case with Mr. Mark Peoples of Detroit. He was, in this particular instance, Mr. Peoples, he was a community gardener, and I believe there was a community space, and there were 3 women who, for whatever reason, there was friction between them. And they kept calling the police on Mr. Peoples, falsely accusing him of harassment and different things. None of those things occurred. However, they kept using these calls to further their purpose. And ideally, they probably hoped that maybe Mr. Peoples would be arrested and maybe they would have the community garden to themselves. Anyway, Mr. Peoples got tired of it and he ended up filing a lawsuit for $300,000. Well, it didn't go through because ultimately he didn't want to have that burden on him. He didn't want to be saddled with the whole prospect of a lawsuit. So he dropped it and he opted to settle out of court. And there are many Mark Peoples out there, right? There are many people who have been on the receiving end of these calls, who feel burdened down, who want who want redress, but it's a lot for them. It's a lot for one purpose. And so the pursuit and acquisition of justice should not have to rest on the shoulders of individuals. There needs to be a system in place to change that. More is absolutely needed. And, it's about time that we call the nuisance calls and the filing of false police reports based on race on what they are, and they're biased offenses that have consequences. And one of the things that when these instances were happening, people would get cute names, right? The offenders would be labeled, poolside Patty, or any other name that sounded cute. And the thing is that it's not cute, it's not funny, it's harassment, and it's harassment based on race. We understand where that perception comes from, but that's no reason for it to continue. So it's my assertion that legislation is the only real tool to stop the weaponization of law enforcement. So I am pleased, this policy memo was drafted in 2019. So at the time, the seeds of change that I'm going to talk about, they reflect what was happening, and I will have some updates to share shortly. But in 2018 in New York State, we see that former State Senator Jesse Hamilton, he had proposed legislation that designated racially motivated 911 calls as a hate crime in New York because he was the recipient of one. He was canvassing neighborhoods in Brooklyn, and someone called the police on him. So that was an instance, obviously, someone who was an elected official actually felt the impact of this, right? And so we see that was happening in New York State. In Grand Rapids, Michigan, the city commission put forward an ordinance for a vote that addressed biased crime reporting. So to set the scene for Grand Rapids, there was a lot going on. There were so many calls that were taking place. And I believe the breaking point for that community, there was an event in a park, and someone called the police on someone who was celebrating a graduation, right? And so it was one of those instances where it was like, enough is enough is enough. And so I have the quote here, participating in their lives. And I believe it was one of the elected officials in Grand Rapids who said that, but they wanted to put a law forth that basically allowed people to just live their lives, right? And not have to worry about any sort of retribution. And some other good news, in 2019, Oregon approved a bill that allowed victims of racially motivated 911 calls to sue. Now, that again, it's the gateway, right? It's the gateway. And of note in Oregon, one of the things that I found fascinating was Oregon is definitely, it's majority white, and I believe that the legislator who put forward this bill, she was a woman of color, but she had the support of her fellow elected officials, and that powerful coalition is important if we're going to put forward legislation for change. So I mentioned that I had some updates, right? Because it didn't stay there. Even though my policy memo was drafted in 2019, I wanted to find out what has happened since. So I did some research, and actually I didn't have to research too far because in one of the cases, we'll see that we have some pretty new updates. But I'll start with Grand Rapids. So in August of 2019, the City Commission in Grand Rapids unanimously approved the revised city ordinance, which addresses various employment, housing, and civil rights protections. And it was actually adopted into law in December 2019. But here's the part that I am really happy about. They added the bias crime reporting prohibition to the city code. So it's part of their law. And what this prohibition does, it makes it a civil infraction to knowingly or recklessly report an individual who is a member of a protected class without reasonable suspicion, there's that word again, of criminal activity. And while these offenses are not considered criminal, you know, violators can be fined up to $500. Now, I think, you know, to some, just like when we think about the Ives-Quinn law, and we think about that commission and how there was some thought where that, you know, there wasn't enough maybe punitive action. I think in this case, I think that this is a starting point. I think the fact that violators can be fined up to $500, I think that's good. I think the fact that their names are out there, I think no one wants to risk to be humiliated, and they don't want to have to go through that process. This serves as a barrier. It makes people think. And again, in lieu of consequences, people have carte blanche to act in any way. This creates a barrier, thus allowing people to think twice. And this is exactly what we need. And in New York, this is awesome. And it was great to actually come full circle with this. The Say Their Names legislation, like I talked about in the beginning, our atmosphere is ripe for change right now. And on June 12th, Governor Cuomo signed into law the Say Their Names legislation, which addresses police reform in many different ways. But here's the part that I'm excited about. The new law makes it a civil rights violation to call 911 to report a non-emergency incident involving a member of a protected class without reason to suspect a crime or an imminent threat. That is huge. It brings us full circle. And I think there's something to be said about New York. I am a New Yorker, so I sway that way a little bit. But you know, New York leading the way as a trendsetter in terms of setting legislation to really, you know, support all people. I think that this will go the distance. One of the things I'd like to follow is to see in the wake of this legislation, and as well as the ordinance in Grand Rapids, I'd like to see the difference. I'd like to see if they notice a difference in terms of the calls that come in. And I think that they can serve as benchmarks for other municipalities, other communities that are looking to incorporate this kind of change. So I say in closing that we need this legislation. And I placed this quote because I wanted to, again, just talk about the reason why it's needed. We're not seeking this kind of legislation to change people's hearts, right? It's about setting an atmosphere of standards for all. And we know that our history has shown how policy and law enforcement as a body has worked in concert to restrict. We have the opportunity in this climate of change to reverse that. We have this opportunity to create a new social narrative. We have this opportunity to stop right now. So it's my hope, it really is my hope, that we will capitalize on this atmosphere of change and really look and address the disparities that we have and see how we can really make life better for all people. And hopefully we will stop this shameful practice of the police and of Black people in public spaces. It really is something that that needs to stop. And I believe it's only until we have consequences, right, you know, in place that we'll see the end of this. But, you know, right now, I think it's up to all of us to advocate, and if we and advocate some more. So with that, I want to thank you all for being a part of tonight's conversation, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Roberta. That was really eye-opening and powerful. We have lots of comments and questions and we have a virtual applause right now in the chat function, and lots of questions. So I'm going to start from the first ones that we received and work our way down. And for those raising their hand, we're only taking questions and comments via the chat function. So just type in your question or comment. Thank you. So first from Mary Lou Hyson, we have a question. What are your thoughts as a former journalist on the New York Times' actions related to Senator Tom Cotton's op-ed on Black Lives Matter protests, where he advocated military action?
Okay, so thank you so much for that question. I have to say that I am not necessarily familiar with that op-ed, so I haven't read it yet. And I'm a big New York Times fan. I have not read that piece. But, you know, I just maybe, if I could get clarity on the question, because I'd love to answer your question, maybe if it was framed in a more general way, because I haven't read that specific piece.
So that was I actually did not read it either, but I read about it. It was a Senator Tom Cotton, who's a conservative Republican, advocated military action against the Black Lives Matters protests. And then there was a huge uproar about the New York Times even printing that that op-ed, and then actually the editor for the editorial page, I believe, was resigned because of it.
So I would say that, you know, we have a right, people have a right to protest, and you know, I think, you know, one of the things that came out of all of this was this whole, the idea of the protesters and the looters, right? And so there was this conflation of the two. And I think it's really important to understand that protesters are just that. And there will be people who will take, you know, advantage of situations like this for their personal gain. In no way should we bring down the force of the military on people who are exercising their constitutional right. So, yeah, they have a right to do that, and we cannot. I think what we've seen with some of the looting and things like that, those are distractions from the real issues. The real issues, we can't lose sight of the real issues, and we know that it's coming from a variety of places. It's coming from people who are looking at this as an opportunity to for personal gain, but also there are many agendas at play here. So we can't lose track of, or lose sight of the fact that we have an opportunity to make real change here, and there will be people who seek to destroy that agenda. And in no way do I think that we should be bringing the military on American people in this way.
Thank you. Yes, we have a comment from Michael Hinckley. Roberta, could you please give us some examples of microaggressions that result from aversive racism?
Sure.
He says, or we can discuss after your talk. This is fantastic. Thank you.
Sure. So like going into a store and being and not necessarily asking for help, but being followed, and you know you're being followed, right? And if you've ever been followed, you know the feeling. And then it makes you self-conscious, but it also makes you question, did I do something? Was I being followed? You start to doubt yourself. But it's the little slights where it could be race, it may not be race, but you feel it. And so that's the thing about microaggressions, is that oftentimes you can't quite put your finger on it, but you know it when you feel it. And I talk about the store because that's a big one. But another one, you know, I had a friend, and she shared an experience where she and her partner had gone into a restaurant, and you know, one is white, the other is Black. And initially, when the server saw the white individual, they were happy, everything was okay. And then when the Black individual walked in, the mood changed, and they were ignored, right? And that's, you know, that's a microaggression. That's a microaggression.
Absolutely. Thank you. And actually, former Governor Deval Patrick said he was followed in stores even when he was governor in
Yeah,
Massachusetts.
right. I mean, you don't have a jacket that says I'm governor on it or a hat, you know, it's like you just have your skin. So how someone views you when they see you is going to be what they think you are, right? Who they think you are, or what, you know, whatever they think you're going to do. And again, that is formed from their own personal lens.
Absolutely. Marilyn Armour asks, what role do you see for restorative justice in the policy recommendations you are noting and suggesting?
Well, I think in terms of restorative justice, I think we have to think, I think the police aspect is good. And I think there are a lot of sweeping reforms that are happening. But I think we have to look at communities, right? A lot of disinvestment has taken place. And when we talk about restorative justice, we have to talk about building up communities, right? Because when you build up communities, when people are able to get loans so they can buy houses, right? When stores can open, what you have is flourishing communities. No one is asking for anything to be given to them, but what we're asking is for smart and strategic investment so that communities can thrive. If we're going to talk about restorative justice, we really need to talk about how we can create playing fields and gateways of opportunity for people, right? Because the biggest thing that holds people back is the lack of opportunity. There are so many people out here who have talent, so many people. I remember I was reading in Michelle Obama's her biography, her autobiography, and she talked about how her I think it was her grandfather, Dandy, or maybe it was an uncle, but she talked about that he was an angry man. He was angry because life had treated him so unfairly. He was smart, but he had done everything that he needed to do, but yet every door was closed. And because of that, it resulted in this bitterness that just stayed with him. And you think about how many people have had their dreams deferred, right? Opportunity, the talent just was dashed away because the opportunity wasn't there. So if we're going to talk about restorative justice, we need to talk about strategic investments so that we can have healthy and thriving communities.
Great. And Michael Hinckley says, agreed, building up communities will reduce spatial separateness, which will reduce embedded biases.
Yes.
And Vicki Smith writes, do you have some suggestions for helpful responses to microaggressions for whites who observe these incidents done to Blacks?
It's tough because, like I said, with the microaggressions, sometimes you can identify what it is and you see it and you're watching and you might pause because you might say, I don't really know if I should intervene. I think that if there's a particular case in which maybe the person who has been grieved, if you see that maybe they're troubled in some way, and you see that there's an opportunity to reach out and to talk to them, in that moment, I would say yes. I don't know if I can necessarily encourage intervening in these situations because you just really don't know. A microaggression is not something that is so overt. In those overt situations, it's really easy to say, hey, what are you doing? You need to stop. But a microaggression, you almost have to think twice of what you're seeing. And that doubt might give you pause. And I wouldn't fault anyone for not intervening in a situation like that. But here's what I would say about microaggressions. As individuals, think about your own perceptions and think about how that plays into the people that you see on the street and your own interactions. Mm-hmm. So while I can't necessarily encourage you to intervene in a situation, my call to action for you would be for you to think about what is the lens through which you see the world, and is there work to be done there?
And to self-intervene.
Right, absolutely.
For those of us who are white, to watch and be conscious of how we respond to things that may be a microaggression, and we may not notice it. So I think that's the place we can make the most difference in some ways, is starting with ourselves.
Absolutely, Megan.
So many questions, so many wonderful comments. Thanking you in appreciation for this discussion. There's a couple of questions about the Grand Rapids ordinance. One question from a couple of people is, how did Grand Rapids define a protected class?
Okay, so they have various definitions for who's a part of their protected class. And unfortunately, I don't have the ordinance in front of me, but it's a really easy find. If you go to Grand Rapids, if you go to their government page, you can actually access a copy, you can access this information, and it speaks to who's a part of it. It's not just based on race. They have many different groups that are a part of a protected class. I'm not sure if it's in alignment with federal classifications, but I think that you will see that it's not just race-based. There are many different variables that are included in that category.
Great, thank you. And there's also a question about it. Is there data about how many people have been fined so far for calls? And the impact of whether there's fewer calls? I know it's still early, but
it's still early, and I actually am really intrigued by that. I actually want to track it on my own because I want to know. I want to know if it's really detracting people, and if they see that it's serving its purpose, will they even give the legislation more teeth? You know, I'm excited to see where this goes. I think because it's early on, I don't know their tracking mechanism, but I did plan to follow up on my own just to see, because I really think that this has an opportunity to go the distance, and I'm going to follow New York as well.
Great. And of course, with COVID-19, it's may have changed things, but the research, and there is a flood of questions and comments about whether we have a similar law in Pittsfield or Massachusetts. If not, how can we make one happen? And I'm happy to say that our state representative, Tricia Farley-Bouvier, is on the talk with us, and she says, Roberta, I'm happy to work with you to make legislation happen. So what are your thoughts about that?
Absolutely. I am thrilled by that. I think, you know, right now, you know, the idea is to work with our elected officials, right? And I am thrilled that Representative Tricia Farley-Bouvier has extended that invitation, because, you know, we too can be a trendsetter in Massachusetts, which we already are. You know, I must say we are leading the way in so many things, and I think that this just adds to it in a major way. So, you know, my goal really is to, you know, I feel like right now there's so much energy and people want to change. And I really believe the time is right. So I plan to continue working with our elected officials and to support them in any way possible. And I think the more people can advocate, I would say on an individual level, what you can do, reach out to your elected officials, let them know we want this, right? Because, you know, they need to hear from you. And when they hear from you, it adds to what's important. So that's going to rise to the top of the agenda. If they don't hear, they're going to say, well, they don't want it. So the more they can hear from you, and believe me, working in the mayor's office, I'm quite familiar with constituent engagement. And believe me, people always let us know what they want. So in turn, let your elected officials know what you want and advocate hard for it. Don't be afraid to call them. Call them.
And do you think that New York legislation is model legislation that we should try to adopt here in Massachusetts?
Absolutely. I saw earlier the Black and Latino Caucus. They had I think 10 points featuring their reforms. I didn't see anything about this, and I was like, well, this should be a part of that. It should be a part of that agenda. I think that there's room for that, because in the Say Their Names legislation, it just wasn't about police reforms. It incorporated this. So why can't we here? We can do that here too in Massachusetts. So I think there's room to incorporate this as we're talking about reforms and carrying them out.
And Tricia actually just wrote, I didn't see it either.
Yeah.
L. Weinstein wrote, Roberta, when are you running for public office? And let's see, a gentleman named Warren says, being a mother of Black children, especially Black young men, how do you feel about the current climate and the safety of your children while being out while Black?
Well,
And you have 3 children, 2 boys and a girl.
I do. And, you know, the oldest, he'll be 17, the middle is 13, and my daughter is 9. And, you know, one of the things is that since they were little, we've had to have multiple talks. I know people say the talk. Well, I like to say multiple talks. You know, it doesn't stop with one conversation. I think from the time that they were little, we've had to talk to them about the outside climate, right? So even though we're in the middle of a lot of national turmoil, even in the absence of the turmoil, we've had to train them, we've had to prepare them. So I think what we're seeing now, it's a little bit more rocky, but we also know that even when we didn't have this, it wasn't necessarily always safe. So my concern has never quite dissipated. It's always just been there, whether we have nationwide turmoil or whether we have moments of peace. That concern is always there. And the best that I can do is give them all the information to ensure their safety, make sure that I know where they are, and give them the tools, right? It really is about empowering them so they can stay safe when they're outside of my presence.
Thank you. And Cheryl Van Epps writes, taking notes, great talk. I'm thinking in terms of the amount of trauma that's induced that Blacks feel from these racially biased actions and the psychological harm done.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw a report on NBC News the other day, and a doctor was talking about that the effects of microaggressions actually wears on the physical body because it's akin to the whole fight and flight response. So all the things that happen when your body is in that mode is what happens when you experience these periods, these moments of microaggressions and assaults and policing. Your heart starts to race. All these things start to happen internally. And for a lot of people, it translates into the buildup of all of these things, translates into poor health, high blood pressure, you know, also mental, you know, the mental well-being of people is under attack as well, because again, it happens here too. You're thinking about these instances, you're reliving them. It is stressful. There's an element of PTSD.
Right, and it definitely affects health.
Yeah.
Tricia adds, because we're negotiating right now with our state legislatures and speaking to her, she says perhaps we can file it as an amendment to the upcoming legislation.
Absolutely.
So that's something that the Berkshires can definitely contribute.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tricia.
And Brandon Patorno asks, what about shifting funds from the police to communities and social agencies?
So here's what I will say to that. We know that I'm just gonna talk locally first, and then I'll talk on the national scale. Locally, one of the good things that we have in the city of Pittsville, we have a great police force, and I think we have to look at every situation in the context of what they are and what they're doing. And if the broader goal is community policing, and we have it, why take away from something that we have? We need to enhance, right? So what are the supports that we need in place to have an even stronger relationship between the community and the police? So I like to say that we have a good relationship in Pittsville. We know nationwide, there's work to be done. And we see the whole calls for defund police. Quite honestly, I think that's the wrong terminology. It's the wrong terminology, and I don't know who came up with that term defund, because to me, it's not about defunding. It's about you're looking at where resources should be spent, right? You don't want to take away police. You want to make sure that you have good policing. I don't think again, I am one person, and I dare not speak for Black communities, because the Black community is not a monolith, right? There are many Black communities, and the needs are vary and they're different. But people people want to be protected. They want to feel safe. What they don't want is to be abused. What they don't want is to be the victims of excessive force. So where in that can we find the space to achieve the community policing, the good community policing that every citizen deserves? And that's my take.
And Cheryl adds, reconstruct the justice system.
Absolutely, absolutely. We know that it's a lot of work has to go into that. We know that, I mean, as we can see from a historical perspective, laws were put into place and things were carried out. We're already operating on a broken system, right? So if we're really going to think about reform, we really have to think about it in a transformative way. We have to identify what's broken, and that's all aspects, right? Not just the police, but we got to look into our legal system. We have to look into how different crimes are judged, right? You know, even thinking about drugs, cocaine versus crack cocaine, and the sentences that come about because of that.
Yep.
Right? Mandatory minimum.
Yep. And a gentleman named Warren says Roberta Dews for governor. That's her husband, by the way. But we also had an interesting comment. Elizabeth Gratch writes, I heard someone say that police with college educations are generally less rash and violent. And the person said that means needing to pay qualified police officers more. So the defund call is tricky.
Absolutely. I think that anytime you have the opportunity to exercise thought and reason and think about things in a strategic and way, rash decisions aren't going to become an automatic response. And again, that's why I said, like, if the goal is community policing, if the goal is to have good police, then the idea is to find ways to make sure that the people who are part of that force are well trained, that they're not just in and out of an academy 1, 2, 3, or that they don't have, you know, multiple standards to go through. We want to make sure that the people who are a part of our police force are people who have prepared, and so that they're ready to work with the community. That's what people want. I mean, people want to feel safe. They don't want to be abused. And so here's the thing, we got to find ways to make sure that the people who are joining the force understand that concept of protect and serve.
Absolutely. And Caleb Keels, who is a recent BCC graduate in criminal justice, writes, reform the police sounds like a great way to look at it instead of defunding.
Absolutely. It's totally about reforms. Like,
and
we have to, I'm not a fan of that term.
And Melissa Barr asks, should our local police let us know of hate groups within our regions?
Absolutely. I mean, I think knowledge is power, and I think that it's important to know who they are. I know that there's always that balance, right? Because there's the intel aspect, and sometimes there are, you know, law enforcement might be monitoring certain groups, and you know, they can't necessarily always share things, but I do know that oftentimes law enforcement, you know, when they realize that there needs to be a communication that is shared with, that the public should be aware of, they'll put it out there. They will. So it's always a balance, right? You don't want to unnecessarily scare people and put them into a state of panic, but you want to keep people informed. And so I would suggest that if people are interested in finding out who the hate groups are, I know that there are many organizations that track their whereabouts, and if you want to delve into that world, you can at least find out if they're in your region. And then if you do recognize that maybe there is a presence, then reach out, to law enforcement and ask questions. I mean, you're a citizen and you do have a right to reach out and get information. So if that is something that is important, I would say by all means carry on with your research. And
I think the Southern Poverty Law Center is one of those organizations that tracks hate groups. And there is also an FBI study that was done a while ago, I think over a decade ago, but was recently updated, that showed that white supremacist groups were actually focusing on infiltrating police forces.
Absolutely.
That's really scary, and that goes back to the importance of training and screening police officers.
One of the things that I, you know, I haven't seen in the reforms, but I thought about, you know, when we have the cases of police officers who have used excessive force, it's important that they can't just go off into obscurity to another town or city. We need to have a database. We need to know who they are. I think that's a very important part of reform. It is important. If it's almost like if you work in a nursing home and you abuse the people there, you shouldn't be able to get a job at another nursing home. They need to know who you are. So if you are violating public trust in that way and you are not fulfilling your duties as a law enforcement officer, I believe that we have the right to know. And I haven't seen the call for any kind of database, but I think there should be one, because people, you shouldn't just be fired and then go to the next town and get a job. That is not safe for the people in that community, and it puts so many at risk and at harm or danger. So
Absolutely. So thank you so much, Roberta, for your time, for sharing your vast knowledge and your insight. And thank you so much to everyone that joined us tonight. Several people asked whether this, where they could find a recording of this. The recording is currently on the OLLI Facebook page, and what we'll do is tomorrow probably we'll send you an email with a link to it, and that'll also be great for the people who weren't able to join us but had signed up. And I'll ask Tricia to just keep us posted on what's going on regarding a potential amendment to the legislation that's currently being considered. I think this is an opportunity to make positive change, and we're really grateful to have the opportunity to learn from you and to have a really passionate discussion about it. I'm seeing tons of thank yous in the chat, so lots of love for you. I will save this chat so you can read it at your leisure later. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and have a good evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.